Hello friends, and welcome back to the Image Creepypasta Iceberg. This time we'll be going just below the surface. Image creepypastas and urban legends are some of my favorites to research because an image can really tell a story. Having a decent story with some form of imagery can really take it to that next level. Let's get to the stories now. This is the Cursed Image Creepypasta Iceberg Part 2. This man is the first entry to start off the second tier of this iceberg. Have you ever seen this man before? Maybe in your dreams? He is said to have been seen around the world, but mainly by residents of major cities. He will appear to them in their dreams and talk to them or give them advice. Every single person who has laid eyes upon this man in their dreams claims to have never seen him in real life. The story goes that at least 2,000 people who were being seen by therapists all reported sightings. Each person's dream involving this man varied in some pretty drastic ways. In some dreams, the man was benevolent and helpful, while in others, he was violent and cruel. A man with this face and depiction has not been identified. This is because this man doesn't exist. Not in a supernatural kind of way, but more as this was all created as a publicity stunt. This man was created by a marketing company to promote something. That something hasn't really been released yet, though it is believed to be in relation to a movie. No movie has been announced or released since. This man also had a website created to go with the viral hoax called thisman.org. The website hosted thousands of fake accounts with this man and even had images sent in from the public trying to identify the man. The website also had theories that tried to legitimize the whole thing. This is honestly such an interesting marketing plan, but it didn't really sell anything. I guess the face of this man is now stuck in the subconscious of the internet. I even read 2 separate creepypastas that claimed that this man was haunting them. Pass It On is a creepypasta from No Sleep. It was written by fellow YouTuber and horror content creator Penny Tails Up. It follows a young child who is rather imaginative and decided to create a game to play while in class to escape boredom. Before that, they would daydream to no end. The game they created was pretty simple to play. It had no name, as naming it would take the fun out of it. All of the kids would just refer to it as taking notes. The narrator would write something on a piece of paper. It could be anything from a joke to the start of a story, or even just random words. The note would then be passed to another person and then to another. The first rule of the game was not to be caught, by the teacher that is. The second rule is that whoever gets the note next has to add something to it. The third and final rule is to pass it on after you add to it. The game ended when the narrator got the paper back. The kids would all then gather around the narrator at recess and read what had been added. This was usually filled with laughter and fun all around. This made the narrator the most popular kid in class, and that in turn made them not need their imagination as much. No, they had real friends to interact with, and didn't need the imaginary ones anymore. It all started like any other version of the game. The narrator wrote something down and passed it along. The paper moved from person to person until getting to a girl named Lydia. She screamed and dropped the paper. The teacher turned around and she said that she saw a big spider. The game continued until the note came back to the narrator. The class seemed quieter than usual, as they exited for lunch. Lydia ran up to the narrator and stopped them in the hall. She asked that they not show anyone the note at lunch today. This confused the narrator until they decided to look at the note. The page started out how most do with the simple writings of kids, but then about halfway down the page was a drawing. This drawing was incredibly gruesome and showed Lydia ripping herself open. The drawing looked far better than anyone in the class was capable of, but someone had to have drawn it. The narrator agreed not to show it and told everyone that they'd lost the note. The next day in class, something was off. The narrator scanned the room and saw that Lydia's chair was empty. There was an odd silence about the classroom, well, for at least half of it. The half that had seen the drawing, that is. Kids kept asking for the narrator to start the next note. It took a bit of prodding, but they finally decided to do it. The note went around the room until it got back, and this time a new picture was drawn. This one was of another classmate, Brian. Brian didn't show up the next day either. The narrator wanted to end the game. They wrote that they didn't want to play anymore, but when they looked down at the page, it clearly said, "Pass it on," in perfect cursive. The handwriting couldn't have been theirs. It was too neat, too perfect. The note was then passed along, but it never made it back to the narrator. Instead, it was actually seen by the teacher, Mrs. Knott, who took the paper and placed it in her desk drawer. That was it. The game was over. The class had lost, but no one seemed to mind. At the end of it all, 7 kids never returned to school. The kids were never told what happened to their classmates. They were kids after all. They were spared the details, but deep down the narrator knew what had happened to them. The idea had slipped their mind for decades. That was until, while drinking alone at a bar, an old woman walked in and sat down next to them. The woman looked mildly familiar, but they couldn't place her face. It wasn't until the woman spoke that they knew. "Pass it on," she said with a shrill voice. It was Mrs. Knott, and as they realized it, a note was passed to the narrator. It was old but clearly the one from that day. She had held onto it for all these years. The woman looked ragged beyond her years. A tear rolled down the teacher's face as the narrator left with the paper. That night as they opened the note, they saw something out of the corner of their eye. A low voice asks, "Did you miss me?" Pass It On is a great read, but I'm not really sold on the ending. I like a little ambiguity in my horror stories, and this one tells you a lot. We can surmise that the entity that started to haunt their game used to be an imaginary friend of the narrator's. This murderous entity then started targeting the kids, the new friends of the narrator. Overall, a good story and definitely one with an interesting concept. Teddy isn't really an image creepypasta. The only reason I'm including Teddy here is because this image gave me nightmares for weeks. This is the image attached to the creepypasta. I don't know the origins of this image or what it depicts, but that's not really important. This image is freaky to me, and I've always been pretty freaked out by creepy dolls and toys. The creepypasta starts with the narrator explaining how their sister had a creepy stuffed teddy bear when they were little. The teddy bear had this weird and realistic face that used to terrify them. The toy scared them so much that they refused to be in the same room with it for a while. Since the family had a dog, the stuffed bear had to be placed up so that it wouldn't get chewed on. The best place to put the bear was on a shelf in the hallway. Every night when the narrator would go up to their bedroom for bedtime, they would see the teddy bear's face around the corner of the hallway. It always seemed to be staring at them. Years later, the sister had outgrown the thing and it was placed in the toy cabinet. The toy cabinet just so happened to be in the narrator's room. Every night they would wake up and see the bear just staring in their direction. That was until one night when the narrator woke up and saw the bear on the floor at the end of the room. Thinking it just fell, they went back to sleep. They awoke again, and it seemed like the bear was closer. After fighting a yawn, they opened their eyes to see that the bear was at the foot of their bed. The narrator pulled the covers over their head and looked out again. The bear was gone. It was all some sleep-deprived hallucination, they thought, and laid back down to try and sleep. They opened their eyes one last time and saw the bear above them on the bed. The bear lunged and the narrator jumped out of bed screaming. The narrator grabbed the bear and threw it in the fireplace. They watched it burn and felt easy in doing so. Now the narrator was 19 and finally moving into their own place. As they were finishing unpacking everything, they noticed a rather large box, left on the front porch. Bringing it in, they saw that it was a cupboard, one that they didn't remember packing. The narrator left it in the living room, and when they came back, there it was. The bear was sitting on the cupboard, staring at them. The story itself is fine, but that image is just not okay. This story is your standard haunted or possessed item story. I like it, but definitely could have used a few more scares. I guess the image was pretty scary all by itself. This picture is what cursed images are really made of. New Cell Phone is a short creepypasta, so I'll be reading it in full again. A couple months ago, my friend's cousin, a single mother, bought a new cell phone. After a long day of work, she came home, placed her phone on the counter, and went to watch TV. Her son came to her and asked if he could play with her new phone. She told him not to call anyone or mess with text messages, and he agreed. At around 11:20, she was drowsy, so she decided to tuck her son in and go to bed. She walked to his room and saw that he wasn't there. She ran over to the other room to find him sleeping on her bed with the phone in his hand. Relieved, she picked her phone back up from his hand to inspect it. Browsing through it, she noticed only minor changes such as a new background, banner, etc. But then she opened up her saved pictures. She began deleting the pictures he had taken until only one new picture remained. When she first saw it, she was in disbelief. It was her son sleeping on her bed, but the picture was taken by someone else above him, and it showed the left half of an elderly woman's face. This image in question is on screen now. Honestly, a very chilling story that seems like it could happen in real life. Crime Scene Photos is an interesting creepypasta that I hadn't heard of until starting research for this video. It's pretty short, but does what it set out to do with its short length. A man named Matt is waiting at a hotel for his friend Mike to show up. Finally, after waiting for what feels like forever, he decides to call him. What he gets instead is the police on the other end. The police tell Matt that his friend has been murdered and they would like him to come to the crime scene for questioning. They give him the address and he walked in that direction. Matt arrives and sees his friend in a bloody mess surrounded by a few cops. His friend was clearly visible on the ground. The cops asked him if he knew anything, but he could pick up that they were also accusing him in the nicest terms. After a back and forth talk, the cops asked if he could reach out to the victim's family. Matt did so, calling Jack, the victim's brother. The two talked for a minute and Jack didn't believe him, so he took these pictures and sent them to him. He finally believed him and told him he knew who the murderer was based on the leather jacket he wore and that he would be there in 5 minutes. Matt didn't know the correlation between the jacket and who the murderer was. Then a thought suddenly came to him as Jack strolled up to the cops. He never told him where the murder took place. I don't have much to say about this one. It's pretty good. On to the next one. Red Moon was written by Avenging Angel and is our next creepypasta. This is the first and only, as far as I've seen, image creepypasta that is a sci-fi horror. You'll see what I mean, but let's get to the story. On July 18th of 2020, NASA launched a spacecraft named the Goliath. The Goliath had 6 crew members and was on a mission to establish the first colony on the moon. Radio communications with the crew were only possible on the side of the moon facing Earth, so the astronauts were told to keep on that side to have constant communication. The side of the moon they were going to colonize had few craters and seemed like a good match for their needs. Electronic journals were to be kept throughout the mission. The only danger came from the meteors as the moon had no atmosphere to stop them. The journals came to NASA daily and they were pretty mundane for the most part. Messages about where schools and hospitals could be placed, ideas for infrastructure with the moon's gravity, and how to properly establish society. Nothing interesting, that is, until no messages were received on the 17th of September. Of course, this could just be the astronauts forgetting to send one. The next day was the same thing, with no word from the crew. After a bit of time, the videos were finally recovered, and this is what was on them. The first video is from the 16th of September, and shows the astronauts exploring a crater near where they were planning to colonize. The video is 10 minutes in length and pretty normal. Near the end of the video, you can hear the crew talking about hearing scratching noises coming from the crater. These sounds were not audible in the video. The next video came from the 17th of September. It had the astronauts investigating a large crater near their site. This one was massive compared to the one from the other video. Everything seemed normal until the scratching sound begins. This time it is very audible in the video. The crew is visibly annoyed by it, so much so that one member walks towards the source and leans over the edge of the crater. An unknown source grabs the astronaut and pulls him into the crater, with the video stopping abruptly after. The final video has a different title. It is titled Code 7700 Please Help. In it, you can see one of the astronauts in an oxygen tent talking directly into the camera. His voice is low but urgent. He explains that he can't contact the radio for some reason, and that 2 of his crew have been slaughtered. The scratching noise starts again and the camera is knocked to the side. Pleas for help are heard as the scratching sounds begin to get louder. Blood and guts splatter on the side of the tent. The video ends abruptly. A 4-man team was sent to fix the communication tower. When the 4 returned, none of them wanted to talk about what they saw. They recovered a few things from the mission, including this photograph. This is such an excellent use of the image creepypasta format. The story itself is really creepy, especially if you have a fear of aliens. It also has this creepy final image to cap off the story. It reminds me of the movie Alien in a few ways, which is great. I will say that there's also some looming dread with this photo. It's so hard to discern exactly what you're looking at. That really adds to the nightmare fuel here. I found a disturbing photo in my family photo album. It's a creepypasta written by K.M. Slyfield. It was posted sometime in 2020 and follows an unnamed narrator visiting home while off from work. The story opens with our narrator explaining the one rule that their mom had was that they weren't allowed to look at the photo album. When they were younger, they would ask why, and the only explanation they were given is that it was very old. This wasn't a good enough reason for the narrator, but he soon forgot about it altogether. The narrator notes that his mom seemed less healthy lately, so he was visiting her more often. While home recently, they noticed that she wasn't just physically weaker, but emotionally. She told him that he was fine and he didn't want to pry. After a night out with some friends, the narrator returns home to their mother gone and the photo album just sitting on the coffee table. This was the chance they'd been waiting for. They opened the album slowly as not to damage it in any way. What he saw wasn't all that surprising. Old photos of his mom and grandparents from forever ago. There was one image in particular that grabbed the narrator's attention, though. The photo showed their grandpa as a teenager, and he was holding a baby. The child was off, though. She had the proportions of a baby, but the face of an old woman. The image was the oldest one on the album and was freaking him out. Later, the narrator decided to visit his grandparents that are now in an old folks' home. They start off with a pretty normal conversation before asking about the photo. The grandpa then yells at him that they aren't going to talk about that. This only fueled their curiosity more. The narrator didn't know what to do next. He spent most of his time sitting at his mom's house. Finally, he asked his mom about the house that the grandparents used to live in. The house was still owned by them, and was actually passed down from the great-grandparents and down to them. There's a chance that he could find something in that house. The narrator decided that night he would go and search the house. He would leave that Sunday as the house was on the way back to where he was living currently. He bid his mother farewell and left for home. He arrived at his grandparents' home and was surprised to see it was in good condition. It also looked pretty typical for a home from its era. The house was mostly empty save for an old TV. The TV worked, but it didn't receive a signal. The narrator explored the house and didn't seem to find anything of value. As he was walking out, a noise from the wall suddenly caught his attention. The house was old. Old houses make noises. At least that's what everyone says. But it sounded almost like an animal was trapped in the walls. The more he listened, the odder the sound was. The narrator ran to the local DIY store and bought a hatchet. He cut one of the floorboards up and pulled it away. Shining his flashlight down, he couldn't see much. The sound was getting louder, though. He took the hatchet again and pulled up a second floorboard. This time he had enough room to stick his head through. He shone his flashlight into the dark abyss of the home and saw it. Here's the exact quote. There in the corner of the crawl space was the most repulsive and disgusting creature I have ever seen. It had human-like flesh that sagged like a puddle around its lump-like body, as if it was wearing a skin that was far too big for it. Its lifeless, hollow black eyes stared back at me like I was looking into eternal darkness. It seemed almost human. It had hands and feet, with nails that curled around like infectious, discolored spirals. It opened its mouth to reveal the most rotten and vile teeth I've ever seen. There were many of them, racked up inside the mouth of the being as if it had grown multiple sets of teeth on top of one another. They varied in decay as they went further into its mouth. The narrator then called the police to explain the situation. When they arrived, they told the narrator to leave the house and they would take care of it. The narrator ghosted his family for a little while, not sure what to think. A few weeks later, he went back to his mom's house and was told that she was gone. The new tenants had just moved in and had no idea who he was referring to. He tried his grandparents' old folks' home next, but also no luck. The receptionist gave him a sad look as she told him that his grandfather had been arrested for the imprisonment and torture of his sister. This story has great build-up, but the ending is rather tacked on. It felt like a lot of questions didn't get answered. I have no idea how or why she got the way she was. Why was she a fleshy monster? How did she survive when they no longer lived in the home? Why was she this crazy family secret? These are all answers I'll probably never get, but I guess that's how it goes sometimes. On to the next one. The Painting in the Mirror is a creepypasta that comes from creepypasta.com and was uploaded in 2014. It was written by Thomas Sarecki and follows another unnamed narrator as they deal with their new apartment. The story opens with a man explaining how no one will likely believe him. Their hand is shaking as they write this even. You would likely write all this off as the scrawlings of a madman. It happened 6 months prior. The narrator needed a new apartment. It was becoming too expensive for him to stay at the dorms any longer. So he and his parents started looking for a new place close to the school. When they were about to give up their search, they found a small studio apartment going for under the value of the area. It seemed like a good deal, even if it was a little small. It was close to his school and there were places nearby where he could work at. They contacted the renter and were told that they would come by and look. If they liked it enough, they could even sign the lease that same day. After arriving, they were expecting to see the landlord, but instead they saw a scrawny courier. The man handed them an envelope and said if they liked the place enough, they could sign the lease and mail it back, and if not, they could just mail back the key. This all seems sketchy, but the narrator kind of had no options. He signed the lease, and even if his parents were pretty unhappy with the whole ordeal, especially his dad, they let him make his own decision. The tiny apartment didn't come with much furniture, except for a mirror that hung on the wall opposite his bed. It was a weird piece for someone to leave behind, but it wasn't that big of a deal to him. Every time he would look down at the mirror, he would see a painting reflected in it. It made him shiver. It was kind of unnerving, really. That first night he swore he saw something moving around the painting in the mirror. A week went by and school was starting up soon. It was draining on his mind, but he was also excited for it to start back up. After a long run around the neighborhood, he dropped back down to his bed and caught a glimpse of the mirror. There appeared to be movement in the mirror. It was the movement of a lopsided but tall creature. It moved so disjointedly that it was terrifying. It also had long, gangly limbs and was covered in ash-colored skin. The figure was getting closer. The narrator could see that through the mirror. It slowly shambled forward and he couldn't look anywhere but at it. He was stunned for a moment, but woke up later, not sure exactly how he had fallen asleep. He awoke to a gray light pouring in from the window. He felt groggy and disoriented, but mostly thirsty. The narrator got out of bed and ran to the bathroom to get some water. He immediately vomited. He drank the water slowly this time. That's when he saw his appearance in the mirror. He looked rough and ragged, almost sickly. There wasn't another way to describe it. After checking his phone, which was dead, he realized what was wrong. He had been asleep for a whole week. Charging his phone, he checked the fridge and found that his leftovers were moldy and the milk had gone bad. He went back to his phone and saw that he had missed a bunch of calls from his mom. He called her and reassured her that he was just fine, just a little under the weather. It took a while, but he was able to quell her anxiety a bit. The narrator's mental well-being was coming into question along with his physical one. This eventually led to him seeking out a mental health professional, and luckily the school provided one. A few sessions in, and the painting finally came up. The therapist asked him why he just didn't take the painting down if it bothered him so much. That was the first time that the narrator had actually considered this option. That night, the narrator was going through the motions of tossing and turning. Eventually, he caught his own gaze in the mirror, and his eyes drifted up to the painting. He wasn't actually sure what the painting was even depicting. He squinted his eyes to look at it, but then felt dumb. I squinted, trying to identify the vague shapes, then finally realized how stupid I was being. I sat up and twisted around in bed to look at the wall behind me. The painting wasn't there. I sat dumbfounded in that awkward position for a few moments, staring blankly at the bare wall above my head. I turned back to the mirror, dread gripping my gut like a horrid claw, and saw the painting suspended over my terrified, exhaustion-ravaged face. Back to the wall. blank whitewash. When the narrator turned back to the mirror, the creature was now in the frame. It started to slowly move towards the mirror, shambling in a disjointed way. He couldn't look away from it. Eventually the trance wore off, but that's when he realized that he couldn't move. He just had to stare at the creature slowly creeping toward him. The creature dominated the entire painting, and only then did the narrator's paralysis break. He tried to run, but the creature reached through the mirror and stuck one massive claw into his shoulder and began to pull him into the painting. The world of the painting was dark but spectral. There were faces screaming in agony all around him, but their eyes were closed. They seemed to not know that he was there. The rest of the story is told from the narrator's new home in a mental facility. He had lived the trauma of that night. Every day was harder than the last. He wasn't allowed to be near mirrors or paintings, and that was probably for the best. This story came from the one time a nurse had given him a pen and paper. He wrote it in hopes that he can convince others that he is sane. Finally, he laments on if there is an afterlife. He would prefer nothing. Anything is better than the world of the painting and the mirror. Painting in the Mirror is a good, slow burn story. I like how you go through the beats of this person's life and what actually led up to the whole experience. The narrator kept trying to live a normal life, but was haunted by some furniture that he should have removed when he first moved in. The biggest complaint is how the painting is never mentioned and then it is. Like, he looks into the mirror and doesn't see a painting originally. When he first describes his room, he specifically mentions that the only piece of furniture that was left behind was the mirror. I'm not sure if the psychosis caused by the painting was what caused this, or if it was just a lapse from the author. Either way, it's not too distracting unless you're looking to review the story. Danny Boy is our next creepypasta. It was posted on the Creepypasta Wiki in 2015, but I can't find an author. The person who posted it goes by the name of Jake Wick. The story isn't terribly long, but it's interesting in how it is presented. It's presented like a real missing persons case. Let's read it. For those of you who don't know, the era of the 1980s wasn't the best time for a kid to grow up in America. Back then, there was a so-called satanic panic going on. Kids were going missing left and right, and everyone was convinced that the cults were to blame. This blame it on Satanist attitude was especially apparent where I grew up, in South Carolina. Around there, blaming non-Christians for problems was as much a part of the culture as guns, sweet tea, and going to church on Sundays. I grew up in a small town in the Sunshine State, but the state soon proved to grow cloudier and cloudier around me as time went on. Things began to go downhill for me when I was 12 years old. I grew up in a little one-story house with my parents and my 8-year-old brother Danny. It's safe to say that Danny could be pretty annoying sometimes. In fact, looking back, I'd say that he was on my nerves more than he was off. Still, I loved the kid, deep down. Once in a while, he and I got along, and the moments that we did see eye to eye, well, they were truly memorable. Our times together ceased on April 13th of 1984. That day seems like a dream to me, now a distant memory. Danny and I had just gotten home from school. Our father was still at work, and my mother was gone too. Leaving a note on the fridge for us, went to Jen's, please run to the supermarket and pick up eggs so I can make you cake. The following day was my birthday. I had almost forgotten. Well, I told Danny to stay put while I ran to the store, but the little bugger informed me that he was coming along. Of course, I argued with him. I did not need him coming with me to the store. He'd been annoying me the entire walk home from school. As I argued with him, I knew in the back of my mind that I had to take him. I mean, come on, the kid was 8 years old. We couldn't leave him home alone. My parents would kill me for that. I finally gave in, told him to shut his mouth and keep it shut, and set out the door with him. Of course, the little annoyance bugged me the entire way. By the time we got to the supermarket, I was about ready to clobber him. All I did, however, was pull him to the side and scold him for about a minute. Looking back on it now, I wish I hadn't. I wish I just embraced his annoyingness. Well, I turned away from the brat and made a beeline through the store, towards the poultry aisle. Always having trouble finding things in the supermarket, I was overjoyed that I was able to find the eggs. I found the aisle, opened the cold fridge door, and grabbed the eggs. All that was left to do was check out and find Danny. I couldn't believe it. I had even kept track of my little brother after I had scolded him. I frantically searched the store, and after not being able to find him for several minutes, I began to ask customers if they had seen a short, blonde-headed boy. No one had a clue. I even resorted to getting customer service to call for him. But my little brother didn't come. The worst part was going home and telling my parents. I felt terrible. The next day was the worst birthday ever, as you can imagine. I still hate my birthday for this reason. For weeks, the police searched for him. My parents frantically combed the entire town, always stopping to post missing person signs all over the place. I couldn't even think of what could have happened. I was scolded by my parents every night for it, but I quickly slipped into depression, taking to alcohol as a means of escape. After a month, the search was called off. No one had any idea where Danny was. He had disappeared without any trace. A couple weeks after the search was called off, the police called in my parents, showing them a photograph they had found in the parking lot of an abandoned store. The case remains open to this day. This story is told in a way that makes me think of a missing persons documentary. It goes beat for beat up to the moment the kid was taken. It even has a moment where they find a piece of evidence that keeps the story going. I'm not a fan of them just finding a creepy photograph, but I get it. This image isn't all that scary, but it does relate to the story, so it's not that bad, I suppose. The Awful Thing We Did to Eliza is a creepypasta that feels like an old folktale. It covers something very realistic and very likely to happen back then. It's a true fear that I have, but something that likely won't happen. The story opens with a young girl talking about a family picture they were finally going to take. The year isn't mentioned, but you can tell it's an early period of time by how expensive the photo is and how hard it is to take one. The little girl talks about how they were all preparing for the photo. She and her brother were sitting on the floor coloring, while Eliza was upstairs in her Sunday best, as she called it. Their parents were sitting at the table with the mom crying. Eliza had gotten sick, and the doctor that came by the day before had pronounced her dead. Still, they wanted to take a family photo. This was the only time they'd be able to do so with the whole family. The idea was very weird to the little girl, but she figured that the grown-ups knew best. She got to see her sister one last time before the photograph. She looked like she was sleeping, except for the gentle rise and fall of her chest was missing. The family went downstairs and set up the photo. The photographer offered to paint eyes on Eliza so that she would appear to be alive. The idea was so weird to the little girl, but she couldn't really say or do anything about it. The eyes he colored on her were brown, but her eyes were actually blue. This wasn't the weirdest part, though. Something just felt off about the whole thing. The photographer told everyone to stay as still as possible so the photo doesn't come out blurry. It took 40 to 50 seconds for the exposure. The family stayed still, and the thought that Eliza would be the only one to come out crystal clear crept into her mind. The day after, the family had a funeral for Eliza. She was buried in a cemetery near the church they attended. A few weeks later, while the little girl was walking through her house, she got a strange feeling. It was as she walked by the new family photo. The photo was framed in the hallway. She hadn't really had the chance to look at it yet. The feelings of that day kept her from doing so. When she finally did look closely at the photo, her heart sank, and she wasn't sure why. It reminded her how the family seemed to be grieving even more after the funeral, and how tired the doctor had looked the last time she saw him. Eliza's face in the photo was blurry. There are a few things in this life that scare me as much as the thought of being buried alive. This is a story that not only captures a bit of that fear, but also makes it worse by subjecting it to a child. The darkest part of the story isn't what happened, though, or that they all knew. It was that it was a sadly common occurrence during this time period. People were misdiagnosed all the time. The number of people buried before their time was very high. That's the part that scares me. This could be a real story. This could be how someone met their end. The girl in the drawing goes by a less advertiser-friendly name. This is a pretty short internet urban legend that comes from Japan. It started making the rounds online around 2009, and has since been passed through multiple internet mystery and creepypasta websites. The earliest date of this picture on the internet was in 2006 when it was posted in a video on YouTube. The story attached to the picture claims that it was drawn by a girl from Japan that took her own life after drawing and posting it online. If a person stares at the image for 5 minutes straight, they will suddenly get the urge to follow in her footsteps. This story has been spread around a lot, but the real thing to look out for while staring at this photo is if it changes. It's said that if it changes while you're staring at it, then something bad is coming for you. Attachment 1 image is a creepypasta written by Top Ramen and is very short. Let me summarize it for you. You hear a sound. It's your phone. You grab your phone and see you got a message. It's from an anonymous number, so you ignore it. No one has your number except for your mom since it's a new phone. You go back to what you were doing and hear it again. You check your phone and see another message. You need to reply and tell them they have the wrong number. You hear a thud on your window and go to check, but no one is there. You hear another sound from your phone and grab it to see that you have another message, but this time it says you have an attachment, an image. You open it to see 3 pictures of you taken from inside of your closet. I found a digital camera in the woods is our last creepypasta on this tier, and it's a bit of an interesting one. This story is not long, actually only 2 paragraphs, but it has a lot of show rather than tell. The story starts with someone saying that they found a silver box in the woods. It turned out to be a digital camera, and it already had some photos on it. The rest of the creepypasta is just showing off those photos. So how about we look through those photos together and see what we might find. This is the first image, and I can't actually see anything too creepy in the photo. Some people have claimed that the tree on the right has a bloody handprint on it, but it looks pretty normal to me. The second image is of this sign telling people to stop. It doesn't have anything too creepy around it either, but it does show the story progression as the owner of the camera went somewhere they might not have been allowed. Image 3 is super atmospheric and really sets the tone of the story way better than the actual story could. Having such a strong visual for the setting is very important. This gives me Slenderman vibes, but in a good way. I'm going to kind of start moving through these because a lot of them don't have much to say about them. The next image is pretty obviously interesting. Here you can see a man or a man-like creature standing behind a tree. The next image of note is image 8. This one looks pretty atmospheric, but people have claimed that this shape is a tiny creature that is watching from above. I can't tell if it's supposed to be something or not, but it definitely looks like something to examine further. Image 9 has these eyes looking down at you here. There's also a similar shape to the prior image. These could be more creatures, but I'm not entirely sure. Image 10 has this shape over here that looks like it could be something walking, but it's really hard to make out. Image 11 shows this old structure in the woods. Of course, we still don't have any idea where this is. If you look here, you can maybe make out a person standing in the window. Image 15 shows an anarchy symbol spray painted on the walls of this building. There are 2 actually, though they also kind of look like pentagrams. It could be either, but I'm leaning more towards pentagrams. Image 16 shows a man standing in the window. The shape is hard to make out, but I feel mildly confident in this assessment. I have no idea why this man would be standing there. Image 17 finally shows the creature or whatever it is. It shambles around like it's lopsided. Image 18 has more eyes following the photographer. The next image is of a tower in the fog, with the following image taken up close. The images show the photographer ascending the tower until they reach a point where they can pull away a plank. On the other side is a humanoid creature. It kind of resembles the rake to me. Sort of. It's hard to tell exactly what I'm looking at. It could just be a person. The next few photos are the photographer trying to escape. The final image is taken from the ground, likely where the person found the camera. This is an excellent and very unique story. It comes off as very realistic because of the photo evidence. I would say that the story isn't super cohesive because it's not meant to be. We're supposed to figure out what's going on based on the images. The images themselves are great. They tell the story in a linear fashion. I can easily tell that there's something chasing the photographer. The blurry movement images are great for that as well. I don't think many other creepypastas could pull this off, but it works really well here. I would love to talk more about this story, but that can be saved for a later video. Thank you everyone for watching part 2 of the Cursed Image Creepypasta Iceberg. I hope you all enjoyed it. There are still at least 2 more parts coming before the complete version after that. Also, thanks to everyone who voted in my poll last week. I'll be working on the Abandoned by Disney video as well. All these videos will be done before the end of the year, hopefully. so I hope you're all excited. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. You guys really help keep this channel going strong. Thank you Blow and O's, Nora Kingsley, and Scout with a Name. I'm going to be dropping more content on my Patreon in the coming months. Thanks everyone, and I hope you all have a good night.